incredible tour de force film by Tom Hardy, and then Jessica Chastain. So very, very quickly, it sort of snowballed into a kind of a dream scenario. So I'm extremely fortunate. I know other writers sometimes have more trouble or more problems, but for me, I was throughout extremely happy and satisfied with whatever they were doing. So it's very fortunate.
So Jack Bondurant was your grandfather.
That's right.
The character played by Shia LaBeouf. So I imagine small Matt Bondurant sitting at this guy's knee, hearing tales of bootlegging and moonshining, and all kinds of crazy stuff going on in those hills. How did you come to know your family's history?
Well, it didn't really happen like that because, my grandfather and his brothers, they never really talked about it. There's a very clear, strong tradition of you don't really talk about moonshine at all, and even in mixed company or family, it's just something that's not talked about. It's almost like it's like I say about politics or religion or something. You don't bring it up. And it's even more so because it could really get you in a lot of trouble. So I think that the older generation, like my grandfather, my own father didn't know a lot of the things that we uncovered. My father and I started doing research sort of together, and we discovered, for example, the shooting at Magotty Creek Bridge in December 1930, which is portrayed here in the climax of the film, which is also the climax of the book. My father never knew that his father had been shot like that, as well as Forrest. And my grandfather was still alive. He lived to be 91 years old, and he was when he was 90 was when my dad found this out. And I was living across the country at the time, unfortunately, but my dad asked him about it, and my dad said he just said, "Yeah, that happened," and he pulled up his shirt and showed him the bullet hole.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And that was it. And I was like, "That was it? That's all he said?" I was like, "Yeah." The guy, the men in particular on my father's side of the family are very quiet, sort of men of few words kind of thing. So there wasn't a whole lot of sort of storytelling going on in that regard. In those, my experiences, especially in Franklin County, you talk about the weather. I mean, they're farmers, so you talk about the weather and the cattle and things like that. Tobacco crop is a big deal. Nobody talks about that stuff, so I had to really dig it up. I mean, the story of Forrest getting his throat cut was known because Forrest was a little different. Forrest was a known outlier, so to speak. I mean, his relationship with Maggie, this sort of mysterious person, the way that they lived together, their secret marriage, they never had children. He was constantly getting in trouble with the law. He was getting, people were trying to kill him all the time. In the book, which is not here too, soon after the shooting, a rival arranged for a load of lumber to be dropped on him and smashed like every bone in his body. He was in like a body cast for like a month, and he walked out. So yeah, but this is one of the stuff I was researching this in the beginning. I was like, well, this is like it's like a Rasputin like figure. You just can't get him down, and that's one of the things that helped sort of create the character.
He's like the Terminator of the bootleg world.
Right?
Who else has a question for Matt in the blue shirt here?
What about the brass knuckles? Is that real?
Yeah, there was one, when I was a young kid in my grandfather's house, there was a sort of back storage room that had like the men's toilet. For some reason, we had to go like use the toilet in the back storage room. And but there was always there was a gun rack in the wall, and then there was just a simple nail with this pair of brass knuckles hanging on it. And it always struck me, even as a very young child. When I became kind of old enough to know what they were or what they were for, and I was scared to death to touch them. But I would pull a chair up and and I would kind of like reach up and kind of feel. I didn't want to take them because I felt like I took them off the nail and then somebody discovered me. That'd be terrifying. But I thought early on, I was like, it sort of made clear to me that my grandfather grew up and lived in a world very much unlike my own, in which that these kinds of things would be something you would have and perhaps employ, etc. In the book, I sort of put them into Forrest's hands. The idea being that after Forrest passed away, that Jack would put them up there as sort of in memory of his brother or something like that. But that was a sort of an icon of my young understanding of my grandfather that sort of stuck with me, and really the kind of the genesis of perhaps the story, I think.
Somebody else? Yes, over here.
So, nobody talked about moonshine or anything like that. So how did you find your research? Online or libraries, or did somebody talk?
There was a series of newspaper articles we were able to find in the Roanoke paper and a couple other papers. For example, they had an account of the shooting because it was obviously a pretty big deal. A bunch of people got shot, so they had some articles on that. And then a real big find was the great Franklin County moonshine conspiracy that's alluded to here in 1935. There was a series of depositions for a grand jury testimony where basically all these moonshiners, lots of them, including my grandfather and his brothers, were brought in to testify or to give testimony against Carter Lee, who's called Mason Wardell here, but in real life the Commonwealth's attorney was a guy named Carter Lee because he had this huge racketeering scheme. So they are asked about various incidents, including the shooting here, a variety of other sort of situations and incidents. So that was a huge piece of information. I was able to sort of hear these eyewitnesses talk about things as they happened. Other than that, there's a few stories. There's a few, we know that Forrest got his throat cut in the county line and all that. We could document that, but as far as like how he survived it, the stories that he walked, and on the map it's like 9 miles, and so I kind of knew that just didn't seem plausible to me. So I created that whole scenario with Maggie that that just seemed made it more possible and more dramatic, obviously. But so there's a few things like that, a few pictures. For example, my grandfather was an old man when I knew him. Really, I didn't do a very good job in my teenage years of interacting with him. We used to spend a lot of time together, but in complete silence, and I was just scared of him. I don't know what to say. But there's a few pictures. There's literally 2 pictures of my grandfather in these years, and there's 3 actually of Maggie. Both of them, my grandfather, are him posing on top of a hood of a car, and he's got the hat, the cocked, and the cigar, and he's got the whole jacket and the whole thing. And the cars, one of them's kind of nice, but one of them's kind of beat up. They're both kind of muddy. But he's clearly posing. He clearly wanted to be seen as somebody of importance and somebody potentially dangerous. And that helps sort of frame the character for me. I'm trying to think of him as an 18-year-old boy. I was asking my dad, like, what does an 18-year-old in 1930 think about? I can barely even, I don't know. And I was asking my dad, and he said they think about the same things they think about now, which is they want money, they want a car.
Girls.
They want to be impressive or dangerous or whatever. It's the same thing. It's just the context is different. So that's what sort of helped create that character. And Bertha Minnick's the same way. She's there's a picture of her posing by the side of the road, which is the one I put in the book. It's sort of what they do here. She's in an outfit that looks more demure. She was a member of the Dunkard Church. Her father was a preacher. But there is also a photo of her wearing a pair of overalls and wearing obviously like a man's hat, and she's smiling and walking towards the camera. In the background, there's these very large submarine stills behind her. So she was actually at a still at some point, which would have been a very remarkable thing to do. Women normally weren't, and so that's what helped. That's what sort of sparked the idea of creating a scene where Jack brings her there, which of course, bad things happen, and that's sort of they took that and depicted. This sort of setup here. But so it was a mixture of some research articles, testimony, and then there's some things that are just sort of legends and myths, and then some pictures. And unfortunately, there's no journals or letters. I wish there were. I mean, that's when I knew I couldn't do it as a nonfiction project early on. It was just I would have had to conjecture, make up a whole bunch of things anyway.
So actually what I was going to ask you, if you ever considered doing it
just
as
very, very briefly, the very
nonfiction.
beginning for the first couple of years, but very clearly there was too many spaces, and then I realized, of course, as a fiction writer, I'd written my first novel at this point, that these big blank spaces were the fun parts. I mean, that's when I got to create dramatic narratives that connected these things together. I mean, I've described before sort of a constellation of possibilities. I had a few of these events, like Maggie Creek, the shooting, Forrest getting his throat cut, these various things, and what I wanted to do was create plausible scenarios that would lead these men into these situations that would cause them to happen, etc. It was a lot of fun.
In the front row.
What is a nance?
A nance. The question is, what is a nance?
Yeah, that's something that's actually not in the book. That's something they get. It's in my basic understanding. It's sort of a being called especially feminine or something.
It's like a Nancy board.
Yeah. But that's the film that the Charlie Riggs character in the book is not really like that. So.
Yes.
Since they didn't talk about it, and now you've written a book, and now movies come out, what's the fans' reactions on that?
At first, it was a little. there were some people that were a little worried about it, mostly some people in the older generation. I think I'm lucky that I have the benefit of time, that a couple generations have passed. There's nobody alive, obviously, from that period. So most of us that are my age or younger are okay with sort of looking at our own relatives as criminals. One of the things that I did, I set my own family up as much as anybody else, and implicated them as much as anybody else, and they were. They did some bad things. They made some bad decisions, but they were men living in extraordinary circumstances. And I think in the end, in the novel, I made that clear, and I think they did a good job here. Maybe that's why I like the ending so much, because the Bondurants in some way are sort of vindicated, and they're not villainized in a major way. And so I'm grateful for that. And I think is when people started to read the book and got to that point, or they came to understand the fiction versus nonfiction. Because early on, some people were like, I thought I was doing a nonfiction account. Once they understand, how fiction works, I think some of these people were people that don't read novels or historical novels. You know what I mean? Historical novels do this all the time. I mean, there's historical figures that are transformed, and one of the biggest novels out now is Abraham Lincoln the Vampire.
But that actually happened,
Right.
didn't it?
So I think it was, and you know what? And when the film starts to come out, and the film is happening, all of a sudden, people all of a sudden get really excited about it, and everybody's much more enthusiastic about it. And I think because film is so much more obviously not real or something. I think they feel that the translation is more clearly not based on an actual thing or something like that. So. There was a few people, but for the most part, everybody seemed pretty happy. Last time I was in Franklin County, I was extremely well received. I had a book signing, and 150 people showed up and bought books. I think most people are pretty excited in Franklin County in particular that a part of their history, that the Moonshine Capital of the World thing is becoming more well known, and it's becoming more famous, and I think everybody's happy to have that.
Nobody's trying to kill you, right?
Not yet. But I am a little worried about it. I'm worried about people just starting to take shots at me in the street.
You walk away.
It's like taking
But
a
you
swing,
come
like,
back,
oh, you're
yeah.
supposed to be immortal, guy. The movie makes a much bigger deal of the immortal aspect. That started with Forrest. It was clear that he was, that he survived all these attempts on his life. One of the things that really struck me in the court transcripts is that they were constantly referring to them Bondurants as being somebody that people were afraid of, etc. And I was like, why would they be afraid of them? How would that happen? My grandfather and his brothers didn't strike me as people that would walk around purposely intimidating people. So it seemed to be very clear and obvious the reason why people were scared of him is because he couldn't kill Forrest. He just wouldn't die. And so it made him very strange. Everybody was kind of freaked out. And so, that speech in there, where he says, we control the fear. And I wrote that. That's pretty much verbatim from the book. And that's Forrest sort of recognizing that this is the power they have. They think I can't be killed. And as long as they continue to think that, we're going to get a much better shot at this than if they find out that I'm actually just a human being, then we're all going to get killed.
I would be remiss if I did not mention that your third novel, The Night Swimmer, is now out in paperback.
Yes, there it
Also,
is.
excellent book, highly
Thank you.
recommended. What can you tell us about The Night Swimmer? I understand you are a fanatical swimmer. You are a swimming fiend.
Well, I'm not sure if fanatical, but it does involve long distance open water ocean swimming, and it takes place on the coast of Ireland. It's a contemporary story. It's not a historical novel in the same way, but it does involve a lot of research about Ireland and these coastal areas, and there's a lot of open water swimming. And so I've done a little open water swimming, partially to sort of do research for it and everything like that. I like doing research, and so it's a heavily researched book in much the same way. And yeah, they put out a new paperback. It came out in January, but there's a new paperback out right now, timed with the film. And thank you for mentioning that, because for the most part, it never gets mentioned at all, because Lawless, it's all about Lawless, which is a good problem to have. Believe me. Anybody?
One more? Two more? Okay, we have two more in the back, in the red shirt.
I want to know if you passed down the recipe.
The recipe.
There are various recipes. I have some recipes, but it's I don't know. I don't really have a standard Bondurant recipe. The way that it went, it was so much of it was catch can that you would kind of make it with whatever you had at hand. So I don't think there was that much of a sort of a purity of the recipe. But I do have recipes. And one of the things I first researched was a lot about the chemistry of it and trying to figure out how to make this stuff, this distillation process. And occasionally I have somebody who will be like, hey. A buddy of mine will be like, hey, I got this farm, Mel's at this farm, we'll build still, and we'll just make it. It'll be cool, just for ourselves. And I'm always like, no, I'm not doing that. And it's not because I'm getting arrested, because I don't want to get blown up or go blind when you drink this horrible stuff that you make. I mean, it's really hard to make well and to taste reasonable, and it's very flammable and there's high pressure. It's just not something I'll ever engage in.
Yeah, there are a lot of bootlegging casualties just from the quality of booze or lack thereof
Oh yeah.
back
Oh
in
yeah.
the day.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Not quite as sexy.
Yeah,
as
I mean,
being a
running it
bullet.
through radiators. There's a scene there where Cricket does that, and they run through these radiators. We made an excellent condenser because all the different turns in it, but it would just leach all these leads and metal solids. I mean, people would be paralyzed. Just horrible things.
I will let you pick the last question, sir.
How about this gentleman right here?
Yeah, could you comment on Tom Hardy's creation of a really memorable character for us versus the character that you created in the book?
Yeah, he definitely he did come with his own take on it, and he definitely played Forrest older. He sort of plays him as a sort of older man thing, and he's got this because in the book, Forrest was in his mid-20s. He plays him a bit older, and the cardigan thing was something he brought in. In the beginning, he came out apparently in a full beard and a pipe. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell you guys this or not. But he came out with like a full beard and a pipe, and the cardigan, and doing this kind of grumpy old man thing. And Hillcoat and the other producers were like, oh shit, this is terrible. What are we going to do? And but Hardy's a method guy, so you can't, and they actually had to get Nick Cave, who Nick Cave is, Nick Cave doesn't take any shit from anybody, and Nick apparently went up to him and was like, you look like a fool. and Hardy was like, all right. And then he went, and then they came back, and he had a more or less shade, he had a less of a beard, lost the pipe, but his thing was he wanted to play like a mother hen kind of thing, like he wanted to be in the movie they kill off the entire family in the Spanish Lady Flu. In the book, the father's still alive, there's other people still around. But they wanted him to be sort of Hardy wanted him to be a kind of a matriarchal figure at the same time as a patriarchal figure. But yeah, his intonations, the grunts and things, that was an unusual thing. That's not really, certainly Forrest was a very stoic man of few words and all that, but that was Hardy coming with his own thing, and that's what those guys do, those actors. They do stuff like that, and either it's really great and works, and people seem to think it's memorable and good, or it doesn't. So I don't know. I guess we'll see. But I think people seem to like it so far. I do think that Hardy obviously has skills, and he's got a physical presence, and he's got a kind of a charisma on the screen. When I was there on the set, I was there for a couple days, and watching him do some scenes, it's there's a palpable sense about him. He's got great energy and stuff, and as a physical presence, he's amazing. So I think it's good. I think it's gonna be cool. I think it's a good job. I'm really happy with everybody. I think Shia was fantastic too. I think Shia has a great emotional range in this thing, and I think it's gonna change things for him. And Jason Clarke as Howard, as my wife was saying to me in the middle of the film, he looks and acts more like, he looks like a legitimate friend. Like he could be in my family. He might be related to me. Seriously, looks and acts just like. Jason Clarke actually went to Franklin County and spent like 3 days with a bunch of my cousins. He called me up. He's like, yeah, I'm going to drive to Franklin County. I want to hear the accent. I need some young men that you know. I'm like, oh, Jesus, all right. So I called my cousins, and they're like, sure. So he shows up, and all of a sudden I'm getting these pictures of him hanging out with all my cousins. And he's staying there like 3 days, and now they're like pals. They're like buddies. Seriously. So, and I think it shows. He really immersed himself, and he was solid. Then again, it's really hard, of course, with somebody like Shia or Tom Hardy that you're so aware it's Shia and Tom Hardy. There's no way for them to really step out of that. But I think the acting, of course, is one of my favorite things about the whole thing overall. Jessica Chastain, I think he does a wonderful job with some of the scenes. So
Yeah, the great Gary Oldman.
yeah, I know, and everybody says, why isn't there more Gary Oldman? And I wish there was more Gary. I mean, everybody wants more Gary Oldman. I agree, but sorry, I don't know.
Matt, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you all for coming.